Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is William Wallace. I am a branch assistant at Wycomico Public Libraries at Pittsfield Branch. And tonight we'll be having a discussion in a series called Each One Teach One. The focus of this Each One Teach One will be media representation or misrepresentation of communities of color. Tonight we will have up to 9 panelists discussing the various topics. This will be a free-form conversation. We don't have a specific set of topics we're going to go over. There are things I have my own talking points, but that if we never get to some of those, it's fine because that's what's most important. I'd like for after I get done, the panelists to introduce themselves. I can point you guys out, or you can start, on your own. Because we could start with, and also, I'm gonna apologize ahead of time. One of my former professors is Dr. Barrett-Gaines, and I will probably make frequent references to something I learned in one of her classes at some point. We can start with anybody who would like to go first. Dr. Barrett-Gaines, you can go first. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, William Wallace. I have to say I'm very proud of William Wallace.
We can't hear you, at least I can't hear you, Dr. Barrett-Gaines.
I'm sorry, is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I am a professor of African American and African history at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which is where William Wallace got his bachelor's degree in history. And from the very moment I met him, I thought, what a brilliant guy. He was incredibly lazy, and he barely ever graduated, but man, what a genius. And the writing is incredible that the guy can do. And now I am so proud of everything he's doing and everything he's saying. And he teaches me all the time. So I'm very proud of William Wallace and proud to be here. I didn't say anything about myself, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the student, not the teacher.
Would anybody else like to introduce themselves next?
Sure, I'll go next. My name is Aston Gonzalez, and I am an associate professor of history at Salisbury University, where I teach African American history and US history. And I'm very, very thankful, William, that you put this panel together. I think it's not only very timely, it's always timely, frankly, but also because I think we'll have a really great conversation. So thanks for bringing us all together.
Who else would like to go next?
Hi, my name is Kymberly Keeton. I am an African American community archivist and librarian at the Aston History Center in the great state of Texas, in the state capital, Austin, Texas. We've been in the news a lot lately. And I'm a PhD student. I just started on Monday. Emphasis data science. Hopefully we'll be doing a lot of research as it pertains to libraries and museums and community archives. And thank you for inviting me, William.
Who would like to go next?
I'll go next. My name is Jim Burton. I teach media studies in the communication department at Salisbury University. I teach courses in media and society, cinema and society. And as you can probably tell, I'm not from around here. I learned this country through its representation, so it always fascinates me to talk about how that comes across.
Who would like to go next?
I can go next. Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Tiki Love. I'm a school librarian on the middle school level. I'm part of the diversity or EDI assembly for ALA, and anytime I can talk about diversity and images that are put on screen or in the classroom or anything that's discussed with students and our teachers, I'm willing to be there, and that's it. Glad to be here.
Miss Love, where do you work? Where are you?
I'm in Baltimore County.
Okay, thank
Hi, my name is, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Anthony Davis. I'm a rising senior. I'm a senior now in high school. I'm currently in Nashville, but I reside in North Carolina. Yeah.
All right. I think it's Dr. Okubo and Okubos, I'm sorry, and
Kiera.
yes, Miss Vargas and Miss Love is gone. So yes, Miss Vargas and Dr. Okubo.
I'm Kiera Vargas. I'm actually Anthony Davis's mom. I'm a director of library studies at Hopkinsville Community College Library. I am also a non-practicing lawyer. I love talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. My whole reason for everything that I've done from becoming a librarian to becoming a lawyer was to fight the injustice of our students. I've spent 16 years of my career teaching K-12 and or college students. I've taught every grade from 6th grade to college seniors, very diverse areas. And, you know, it always makes me feel good to talk about the issues and with hopes of changing the climate of our educational arena.
All right.
I'm Wallace Southerland, the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs at Salisbury University. And I bring to the table 29 years of higher education experience. And I am an avid moviegoer. So I pay a lot of attention to images on the big screen.
Dr. Okubo.
Hi everyone, my name is Yuki Okubo. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department at Salisbury University. I study racism and coping, and I teach classes ranging from mental health issues to multiculturalism. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for all being here.
Hey, William Wallace,
Yes, ma'am.
can I tell people a little bit about you?
You can if you would like.
So William Wallace is a fascinating human being, and one of the things that he did for me was he allowed me to have the exercise of helping people understand that everything has a history, because when he was a senior and he was supposed to write his history thesis, for his degree, he said, I don't care. I don't want to do anything. And I said, well, you can write about anything you want. And he said, I don't want to write about anything. I said, you can write about things, anything you like. He said, I don't like anything. I said, just think of something that you like and it has a history and you write about that. He said, I don't like anything. I said, do you like money? Do you like, and he said, I like comic books. I said, great, they have a great history, they're fascinating. And he wrote a fantastic history thesis on gay characters, Black characters, and female characters in Marvel, right? Marvel Comics?
Yeah, Marvel Comics.
It was fantastic. He gave 3 public presentations. He did an amazing amount of research. He did fantastic. He just came alive. And I always use him as an illustration of someone who thinks they don't like things, thinks they can't do history. But when you find the thing you love, you do it really well. So that's William Wallace. That's why I'm here, because he's the greatest.
Thank you.
You had me at Marvel, so.
I would like this to be as candid a conversation as possible, because the purpose is to understand things. And sometimes the human element is, reading Mr. Kendi's book, he interweaves the human element. In Dr. Barrett-Gaines' class, she would have us read usually a nonfiction that's centered around an actual person, or if it was fictional, it was from the street level perspective. And sometimes you need to hear that. And in addition to each one of you having professional or academic research or experience that can inform this conversation. And, you know, I usually have a list with me, but I can't find it. But, you know, there's something in there is don't save it for later, say it now. And also, we're going to have to listen. It's important that at some point in this conversation, somebody may say something that makes you feel convicted. And unless it's outright, you know, problematic, then it's just them telling their story and it having an effect on you. And you should reflect on that before you you know, get defensive or think about your response. But having said all of that, if there's anything that anybody would like to start off with specifically, I will open it up to you. Like I said, I will recognize you by choosing the raise hand option, but if not, I will start with some of the talking points that I have. So if anybody would like to, just let me know now. If not, I will, you know, start with my talking points from my research. Okay, well.
Go for it, William. It's your show. Do it.
All right. One of the things I think we should start with certain terms. Well, there's also a quote that I like that because I think this explains it. It says, representation isn't just doing what's right, but understanding why it's right. I think that quote will hopefully guide this conversation, but I also want to explain certain terms that may come up during the conversation. The first term or first two terms are person of color or people of color. This is usually covers all or any peoples of African, Latino / Hispanic, Native American, Asian, or Pacific Island descent. And the intent is to be inclusive. The other term is BIPOC, which again connects to the other one, and it refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but it has a particular emphasis on the historic oppression of Black and Indigenous people. It's meant to narrow the focus a little bit more. The other term I would like to make clear is microaggressions. The term is used for brief and commonplace daily, for brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative, prejudicial slights and insults towards any group, particularly culturally marginalized groups. Another term is respectability politics, a form of moralistic discourse used by some proponent figures, leaders, and academics who are members of various marginalized groups. When these figures promote respectability politics, this may serve as an attempt to police some of their fellow group members. Proponents of respectability politics may be attempting to portray their personal social values as being continuous and compatible with dominant values. They may prefer not to challenge the mainstream for its failures to accept the marginalized group into the mainstream, and that diversity that also exists within their group. And that should be it. One more thing that I didn't include in here is I would, if any false equivalencies crop up, I will not hesitate to make it clear that those don't apply. We, in this, like, well, for an example, is reverse racism. Reverse racism is not real. And we won't entertain that as such. But my first point was, I was reading an article called South Asian Characters Can't Come of Age Without Assimilating. And it's written by columnist Hidayah Kuhn. And she talks about these common themes, these things that are common in South Asian coming of age stories, but I also noticed that there was a lot of overlap for POC stories in general. And it's, you know, the narratives usually involve a male or female lead character, and they're usually chafing against their conservative culture. And it's that conservative culture tends to be represented by one of their parents that is, you know, and the main character tends to be overly concerned with mainstream white culture and fitting into that culture. It also usually turns out that this character, they're either trying to be with, seeking, or end up with a white or white passing partner who, you know, that partner just happens to understand them and affirm them in a way that is seemingly, based on this narrative, impossible with a partner of color. The white partner is saving them from their limited and backwards Black or brown families, communities, and culture. And it's also this trope, they're usually made for white audiences. I love to use the example of Boys in the Hood. They like to confirm expectations about those communities. They're comforting to white audiences. And then, you know, they don't ever really actually represent in a genuine way the communities that they're supposed to be about. It's more of, well, you know, you're right. This is what happens in Black neighborhoods. This is what actually happens in Asian communities. They do just treat women so horribly, you know. And it's like, I'm trying to read through my notes. I wrote specifically for myself, I think I'm dealing with others' prejudices and the expectation with, I think that's when they talk about microaggressions in her article. As a reminder for myself, I realized that, you know, racism that people of color experience, though it's not portrayed this way in narratives, is, people will say, well, why do you make everything about race? I probably don't. I don't actively think about being Black most of the time, but I'm usually responding to other people's expectations about me as a Black man, as a gay man. And that's, you know, that's something that I think is important too, is that too often people of color's narratives has to be about their race, when that's not necessarily how people of color live their lives. You know, and it also is like, it has to be about your race specifically, and then it also has to be traumatic. It can't be, you can't have a Black, Asian, or Latinx story about it just being them going about their lives and then how microaggressions and outside expectations slip into their lives. So if anybody, I'm gonna open it up to anybody if they would like to reflect on what I've said. If not, I can continue. All right.
Well, I actually want to say something. You actually said it's a lot to unpack, but one of the things that stood out to me was The Blind Side. That was the first movie that came to mind, where the young man, he couldn't just be successful by himself. It took a white woman to save him. And then I was also thinking about it, I'm looking for it right now, Jeff Hobbs. I really loved his book, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. He just wrote another book. It's called Show Them You're Good. And at the very beginning, he shares how he's trying to document students at this particular school, and he doesn't want anyone to look at them via race. He wants them to look at them, and it's such a beautiful quote. I can't find it right now, but he shared, instead of looking at them from a socioeconomic component, it's in the intro, or look at them from the color of their skin, look at them as they are. And it's really hard for people to do that.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things I think was more in Dr. Kendi's book, but overall in this research, is that there's this need to remove the race of people of color before you can see them, or make an exception for it. It's like, oh, that's another thing about the having a white partner, is suddenly you're elevated because they see past your Blackness, your brownness, and you're still attractive despite that. And it places the white gaze at the center. And it's like, Black and brown people should be afforded the same personhood as a white male. you know, a cis white male in, you know, that we don't have to put our race in the background. We don't have to ignore it because it does inform so much about who we are. But I do agree with the narrative that in the article I was reading, it subordinates the character of color. Again, it goes to telling their story from what is, again, a white gaze perspective. It's like we can't achieve things, we can't make progress without a white person helping us get there, which is basically what you said. But I think that that was an important thing that has come up in a lot of the representation, the reading that I was doing, is that most POC representation comes from a perspective of safeness, and there has to be a white character that's a part of it. I remember reading reading about it and then watching the interview for the creator of Orange is the New Black. And I remember her saying that she knew that she needed the character of Piper, I believe is her name, so that people would engage with the stories that would later on primarily focus on these women of color. I think you see that more and more with a lot of narratives, is that they want to change the race, even if the narrative was between two people of color, that they want to change the race of one of the partners so that they're white, because the assumption is that white people will not engage with a narrative that is about people of color. And there is
Can I point something out, William? This is Orange is the New Black was a book, and I read it before you know, it was made into a TV thing, and it's written by a white woman, and it's written exactly because a white woman went to prison. And that was what made it so interesting to the publisher. It never would have gotten anywhere if it wasn't a white woman who went to, a middle-class white woman went to prison. That's why anybody even cared about the story to start with. So it wasn't the TV show that, you know, kind of went back to the white character. It was the white character that brought the story out to begin with. And that kind of, I think when you talk about solutions, right? What do we do in our minds to decolonize our minds? And we think, like, we have to, like you said earlier, we have to go to the history to figure out, you know, why do we think this way? Where did this come from? So that we can kind of have a truth and reconciliation with our own brains, with our own minds, to how we got here. And yes. I was talking this summer, you know how this summer all of us, professors and teachers, went through 1,000 workshops to become better online teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And I was in a workshop this summer, and we were talking about teaching about Africa. And there was a lot of different teachers on the call. There were a lot of K through 12, et cetera. And somebody said something like, you know, whatever you do, don't compare, don't use, you know, don't say, look, African kingdoms were just like European kingdoms. African kings were just like European kings. And they were like, you know, don't compare Africa to Europe as Europe being the standard. And there was a white professor, a teacher of some sort on the call, who said, no, help me understand this, because I thought that for my Black students, if I point out that the Black kingdoms, the African kingdoms, were as sophisticated as, you know, the European kingdoms, that will be good for the Black students. And she said, I don't understand why you're telling me not to do that. Please help me understand. So I gave her this little mind exercise. I said, imagine what it would take for you in your own life to be able to compare white kingdoms to African kingdoms. To be able to say the British monarchy was as sophisticated as the, you know, monarchy in the ancient kingdom of Mali or something, right? Think about what it would take for you to be able to do that. it would take an entire reorganization of your mind. It would take entire reorganization of the library of books on your shelf. It would require you to watch a lot of movies, to read a lot of books, and to reorganize yourself around Africa, as opposed to organizing your mind around Europe. So it's not a small task. It's a big one. And it starts with that, imagine if you had to, and that's how we have to start. But it's a gigantic thing to switch our minds around like that.
I mean, one of the things that Dr.
Ms. Tiki Love had a...
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what you both were saying. So the big thing I think also is just the fact, when we think about it, when we think about movies, who's in the room where the movies are pitched? Who's in the room when the movies are written? If we think about classrooms and education, who's in the room when the textbooks are selected? Which textbooks are selected? Who's writing those textbooks? And so the big thing about representation as well is thinking about the fact that if we think about the people that are creating these items that are being disseminated to others, whether it's in the classroom or movies or TV, their experiences and whether or not they've broadened themselves to look outside of their community or their own experiences and knowledge base about different communities and cultures, and can put that into film, textbooks, their knowledge base, etc. So that was just the big thing I just wanted to talk about, the whole idea of people just have to consider their mindset, and if they have a mindset that might be a little narrow-minded, to learn about others in order for us, to get to that point.
It's interesting what both of you just said, because it was what I was looking at the most today. What I'd been looking through is there was a producer named Effie Brown who 5 years ago, on a segment of a show called Project Greenlight, spoke up in the middle of a conversation with other producers to the two big name actors, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. And what I would almost, I don't know if my audio works because I don't remember how to connect the audio of my computer, but she is attempting to articulate a point from her perspective as a Black woman about why this Asian male and white female director team might be the better choice to, direct this movie, because it has a Black woman, and I think the lead is a sex worker, and she gets shut down almost immediately. I mean, he doesn't even give what she has enough space to just pass between his ears. And then he proceeds to white-splain it to her, what her place and other talent of color's place is in media production. And I think that seeing that it was years ago and it stuck with me since, it encapsulates, she I wrote it down. She called it she referred to it as the lonely only. Is that it's like, it's not enough to have, diversity is not enough. It's not enough to have a Black person, a Asian person, a Latino person in the room, because we're this dynamic people. Just within a particular community, you can have a room full of all Chinese people or Chinese Americans, and they won't see the things the same way. You can have you can have Black people, you can have an African American, you can have a Black West Indian person, a Black African, and a Black European person, a Black Canadian in the same room, and we will all come at Blackness a different way. And it's not enough to have us in the room. It's not enough to have us in the room. Even if you had that diversity of people in the room, if they're all going to agree with you, they have what's the point of having them there?
Right. can I bring you would love this story. Did you hear Jon Stewart talk about what they did at the Daily Show?
No.
This is really interesting. So Jon Stewart, used to host the Daily Show before Trevor Noah. In fact, he picked Trevor Noah to replace him, and you can understand his story about why he did that. He tried that for a while. Like people drew his attention to the fact that his show was completely dominated by white male interns, white male writers, white male everything. And he was like, oh yeah, you're right. So they started to put the lonely onlys in there, right? And then he became educated over 15 years. He started to understand what was happening. And he realized that it wasn't just about hiring a black guy, because you were basically going to hire just another black guy from Harvard with the same sense of humor as every white guy from Harvard that writes for you right now. He realized that they had to change as he said, change the streams from which they were getting people. They were traditionally getting them from interns, college interns. Now, who has time and who can afford to be a college intern? People with money, people with parents who support them. This is a certain kind of person who gets to internship to be an intern in college, right? So right away, you're already Xing out number of people who can't afford to be your intern. So he realized they had to change that stream. They had to not rely on interns and expand the stream to include veterans and people who are not coming from college and all sorts of different kinds of people. So they had to completely change the stream from which they were drawing their talent. That changes the dynamic of who is in the room. It's when the white guys with all the same brilliance that they have, and of course, he's like, hey, we're the Daily Show. We know all about political correctness. We know all about being the smartest guys in the room. It took them 15 years to slowly learn that they were just replicating themselves over and over and over. And so it's not impossible for white people to learn. It's just a long, long, long process.
Alec, you had a
Cheryl Sidwell had her hand up a few minutes ago. I just wanted to make sure she had something.
Did you want to say something, Sidwell?
No, I just said something to Allie outside of this, but since you called me, I will just mention along these lines, a film, and this I believe is French produced, Embrace of the Serpent. So it's again European produced, but one of the things I really loved, they kind of similar to what you're saying, there's on Indigenous lines, there's always this presentation that Indigenous culture is less than, that somehow Indigenous people are not as intelligent, they're not as evolved, they're not as technologically competent, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I really loved about that film is that it made an attempt to actually, they did translations using Indigenous language and to show or portray the Kaina culture as being at least equal, to be different, but to be not stupid, not ignorant, not less than. And in fact, the white guy, the European, who's like looking for this Indigenous medicine, is trying to learn something. But it's a great film. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It at least makes an attempt. It's one of those ones that really, I was kind of blown away because it was the first time I had seen a film that showed Indigenous people as equal to. I was thinking about this because you were talking about African kingdoms and European kingdoms, and how we use European as the standard of what is best or whatever. And the same thing with Indigenous cultures, where there were these incredible evolved civilizations in both North and South America before Europeans ever set foot here. But because Europeans came over and because of the genocide, in part from disease, we see these cultures as less than or less evolved.
Or
in fact, that's not
these cultures as something in the past, rather than the fact that Native Americans walk with us today. But
it was really cool. The other night at the Democratic National Convention, a Native American
can't hear you.
Oh, put my microphone on. Is that better?
Yeah, now.
A Native American member of Congress, I don't remember her name, she pointed out that she's a 35th generation American. 35 generations. There's nobody in the world who can count 35 generations.
No.
But so that's, that's the kind of thing we need, that people, to really let that sink in. 35 generations that she can count living here. She's not a foreigner. She's not an immigrant. She's been living here for 35 generations. That's the kind of thing that will help, I think, if we let those kind of things sink into our minds as we hear them.
Well, it's two things that you said that kind of stuck with me. It was, one of them was, I remember reading, my mind works in 10 different streams at once. It was something you just said about the learning process. There's been a controversy. Well, I prefer to think of it as has others. In the last month, we've seen a lot of white actors step away from roles of color. These were largely voice actors. And we've seen a lot of blackface episodes from series get taken out of the lineup of episodes. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that that's a surface response to an issue that's being asked to stop murdering us. Justice for murdered and slain Black people. Those are meaningless to respond to those, which is not to say that representation is not essential. I think representation is absolutely essential because it may be the only time that a Black person, an Asian person, a Latino person is seen and humanized for white people. But there's one of the actors who plays a Black character for Family Guy. I forget the name of the character, but he had been playing this character since 1999. My niece was born in 1999. She is 20 years old. It took him 20 years to realize that he didn't have any business playing a Black person.
The Simpsons, the people that play the Simpsons characters?
It's not, Hank Azaria is one person, because I know there was a whole documentary about, the problem with Apu. And it basically, Hari Kondabolu basically kind of talks about a lot of the things that we talk about now. And there's this overlap in people of color that I just kept realizing, and it's actually has, and I would like for Dr. Burton to get in because he is the specialist on media, but it's actually the funny thing that for me that kind of crystallized this whole conversation was not even television, but actually, live action television or movies. It was animation and video games. Because I was reading this, so many of the white voice actors, and one in particular, there's a character in a video game, and the character is called Gears. And I was, my nieces and nephews, that's one of the reasons that I'm glad that Mr. Davis is here, because he is the age group. The character is Latinx. And I assumed that they were, not because of the character herself, but because all the characters around her were being played by Latino actors, and I recognized their voices. So I was like, this character must be Latino. And it made me look into it because, I mean, you can't assume somebody is or is not Latino based on their voice or even their skin color. But I looked it up, and it was in fact being played by a white woman. They clearly wanted to identify this character as Latinx by having, not only giving her a Hispanic last name, but the supporting characters around her were played by Latinx characters, but the lead character was a white woman. And what I did as I was reading all of this, it was like so many of the white actors you will hear talk about, well, anybody can play anybody. And a lot of white actors that I was reading about, they all came from the place of we're all human and we could tell those stories or whatever else. But then when I would read, it was at least three separate actors of color that I was reading about that were voice actors. One of them is Devin Mack, Bill Butts, excuse me, I think it was Bob Butts actually, and Dante Bosco offered an entirely different perspective on it. And it goes back to, again, Matt Damon, and another example, again, I'm gonna jump all over the place, but they're all connected, I promise, I remember years ago hearing some of my older relatives talk about John Amos leaving Good Times because he thought that JJ's character was poorly representing the Black community. But I recently watched a video of him being interviewed, and he didn't choose to leave the show. He was written out of the show because he had complained one too many times to Norman Lear. And we all think of Norman Lear as this progressive, liberal ally. But a Black man was telling you that this representation was problematic. But no, that's what white audiences liked. So rather than fix it, you got rid of him, you know? And that again connects to the fact that, Effie Brown, people will say, oh, well, what Matt Damon did or whatever else happened X number of years ago. But that was 5 years ago. And only 5 years later is Effie Brown getting her career back on track, these different actors are talking about over the course of their career that they have, you hear this, you get told, oh, anybody can play anybody. But when these actors would go to, audition for it, they were not welcomed into the auditions. They did not get called back. There are all these barriers, as I think Dr. Barrett-Gaines said before, there's all these barriers to entry to get in. And this was even after all of these actors were doing acting classes and doing everything to make themselves, seen to have these credentials. They were doing the work. They were going to classes and all these sorts of things. But it came back to this insidious idea that, again, I go back to Dr. Kennedy's book about being an anti-racist, is that, and this goes to the historians on the panel, is this mentality of Black people and brown people as not possessing essential humanity. That we, Donald Glover talks about, he wasn't even being actively considered for the role of Spider-Man, but his name had been floated out there. And he had gotten all manner of overtly racist responses to that. But he said the thing that actually pissed him off was this white man who wrote in, this well-meaning white man who wrote in and said that they just don't make Black and brown kids like Peter Parker. What the hell did that mean? That it's this notion of, again, well-meaning white people, and it's largely because they're probably not around Black people or brown people or Asian people. But then that goes to, it's like it's something eating its own tail. If you don't include us, we will never be able to show you our humanity.
Oh, sorry.
Miss Vargas and then Dr. Barrett-Gaines.
So I'm going to call on my son for a second. Anthony, say hi, and show them your shirt. He actually wore this shirt that he created. And the shirt, can you read us what the shirt says? You're muted though.
Yeah. It says, when will you see like us? When will you learn to see us? And when will you
should know.
And when will we be seen?
And on the back of it, he has eyes. And I say this because I'm piggybacking off of what Mr. William Wallace says, Dr. Wallace says, people don't take the time to get to know our young men. I've taught for about 16, 17 years now, And I actually gave a presentation a couple of months ago on diversity, and it opened up one of the things as librarians that we need to be mindful of. And it's not just librarians, it's people in general. And you're going over this. We have to be open-minded. So when we meet someone, we can't just make a false assumption of who they are. If my son stands up, he's 6'2". And the first thing that people always ask him is, do you play basketball? No, he does not. Now he does play basketball, but that's not the only thing that he's good at. And so people, when he opens up his mouth to speak, oh, wow, the microaggressions that you spoke about earlier. Oh, wow, you speak so well. Then when they learn that he's visited 17 different countries, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. And so I share this because media and just people in general, they have a false notion of who people are. And until people are able to be open-minded, you're not going to be able to see the greatness of this young man. You're not going to be able to answer those questions that he has on his shirt. Can you let us see those questions again? But the questions are, when will you see us? Learn to see them outside of what you think media representation is. Just because he's tall, just because he wears a hood, just because he wears a certain type of shoe, just because of whatever, that does not mean that he falls into the category of all Black people. And so that's something that we do have to take into consideration, and we can't do that again until people are open-minded.
Well, I think that where I would come into the conversation in regards to representation and history, which I think history should always be a part of any conversation when you're talking about race. First, we have to be very mindful that African American people were not considered human until 1870, as it pertains to the census, okay? So if we're looking at 1870 and we're in 2020, and today Black people are popular based upon George Floyd being murdered, then let's do subtraction and go back to 1870. Okay, that's a lot of years where, I mean, you know, and I'm not a mathematician, but I will say that, you know, for me and listening to everything I've been listening to, what's important is that everyone know who they are and from whence they came. What does that mean? Genealogy is very important in any situation today. When you look at media and where we are in this moment, I believe that African American people, people of color, you now have the opportunity to, if you so choose, to rewrite a lot of what we're discussing or what I've heard. And I'm saying that because when you know your history, you walk differently. I know 8 generations on both sides. That's a lot of work. It's not as if I knew that in the first 10 years of my life. I will be 44 on September 7th. And I no longer have my parents. I no longer have my grandparents on both sides. So how have I been able to maintain who I am and then knowing my history? Of course, that has a lot to do with passion, but I also believe that the one thing that is lacking is everyone knowing their history, because when you know your history, then I think we can get to the conversation of representation. But white people do not know their history. They don't know the slave owners that own Black people. And when you don't know those stories, then you don't see the stories that you're talking about right now as far as media representation. That's why the characters are still happening. That's why we have the WAP video, WAP, however you want to pronounce it, that just debuted by Black people, okay? When you know your history, you just, for me as a historian, you see things differently, so you choose to do things differently. And I think that comes from both spectrums. And it's missing in all conversations that I've been a part of since March 10th. You know, we're talking about solutions. You know, okay, so who is your second cousin? Who is your sixth generation grandmother? You should know that information. Why don't you know that information? And we're not just talking about Black people, we're talking about all people, because see, when we can get to that point, I believe, when you can get to the point of you accepting history, that's when history will change. You know, taking monuments away, which is a part of media representation. What is that doing? We can't forget history. I mean, Black people got here somehow. So, you know, for me, in listening to everything that I'm listening to, I believe it's all important, but I also believe that history speaks in volumes and it repeats itself. And if we don't, I feel as though for this generation, this present generation, if we do not teach them their history, we're not just talking about what happened to Dr. Martin Luther King, what happened to the Black Panthers, you know, what happened last night with this cartoon character. If you don't know your own history in our own homes, then I don't understand how we can, you know, even get to media representation.
Well, I mean, I think it is incredibly important to understand one's individual value, period. But I think it's a chicken and the egg type thing, because it's like, that's why I said that media, I am a big fan of media, talking about media representation, because it teaches, it does so much insofar as teaching us lessons. It is taught, you know, the same way white people were taking in the information of media, Black people were too. People were internalizing that message. One of the many videos that I watch, and I say just Black people because I am one, but when a lot of the videos that I sent to you guys and the ones that I watched privately were that people of color, period, were internalizing these messages about themselves, or that because their history was not being taught to them. And there is no question that we can say that people should learn it, but the fact is that I even as a high school student, I was not that engaged in history. I liked it, but it wasn't, and it's important I have to be willing to admit that the person that I was when I was Mr. Davis's age, you know, valued white perspectives too much. I wanted to be approved of by white people. And it was something that I had to evolve away from. And that's why it's important, because sometimes the school's not going to do the work, but we can maybe get better representation in media, is that it tells the Black kid, the Asian kid, the Latino kid that we see you, that you're normal for reading books, for liking video games, for whatever else. I mean, that's where I think media is important, is to start sending these messages to young people that they're.
But can I challenge you, William Wallace, along the lines of the last speaker? I think that if I would challenge you to have this conversation without using the word media, because media is not a person, it's not a thing, it's a means by which people's representations are gotten across. These are people doing this writing of these films. These are people writing television and producing television shows. It's not media, it's people. So along the lines of the last speaker, Ms. Keeton, that those people need to know more. Those people need to read more books and learn more things. All of us, like you said, need to know more about ourselves and about each other. So if I challenge you to say everything you're saying, but put people instead of the word media, I think it'd be different. Now you're also, this whole thing is a real advertisement for the power and the importance of the humanities, of studying history, as Keeton said. That history and reading any book, any kind of book, helps you understand that other people are people, human first, and after that doing whatever they're doing. That's amazing. But Wilbert Rideau is one of the most famous prisoners from Angola prison in Louisiana. He was in for a long time, and he
having a little trouble.
And he got out, and when he got out, that's crazy.
noisy. My microphone's right
Well,
in
I can
front of
hear
me.
you.
I'm sorry.
You seem to be fading a little bit.
Is that better? Is it?
Yeah.
Because he said that, and I used to speak in prison a lot down the Eastern Shore, the Eastern Correctional Institute. And he said that, you know, people would go to prison, and I even read this in books by people who got out of prison, and they would say that the thing that made them understand things was they would be in prison and they would just read books. They would read novels, and they would realize that there are other people in this world, and they had families, and they were human, and they realized, oh my God, I killed somebody. I killed a person who had a family. And that was the first time that they felt there were other people in the world besides themselves. And I think that's one of the characteristics of whiteness, the disease of whiteness, is this idea that there's nobody in the world but me. And there's especially nobody in the world but other white people. And the farther away you are from being white, the less you mean anything. I have to talk about, if you took the word race, got rid of it, and used the word difference, the farther my nose is from your nose, the less I care about you. The more you are like me, the more I care about you. The more you are unlike me, the less I care about you. So yeah, the black people that look like white people, we care about them. The black people who sound like white people, that makes sense. The black people who dress like white people, right? You know, you get it. So I think that it goes back to, you know, read more books, have more experiences, and you know, in order to learn that people are human beings first.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I think it's nuanced in the sense that it goes back to the original point of you have to know that you're not seeing somebody as fully human. You have to, and it's uncomfortable for somebody to admit that you I'm sorry, I'm looking off to my colleagues who are pointing things out to me. You have to be willing to admit within yourself that you might be engaging in this kind of thing. And that's the problem people often talk about, Dr. King talked about in, you know, Letter from Birmingham Jail, is that it's not the Ku Klux Klan that's the problem, it's the white moderate. The white moderate has to, and in this day it's the white liberal, has to ask themselves, am I a part of the problem? And that's where you can read all the books about, you know, you can listen to all the hip hop and all the rest of that, but until you understand the humanity of a person of color, then you can't even begin to write about them in a meaningful way, because information is just information. And as in your classes, you would give us something that gave it a human element, and then there was the informational element. And that's the thing that's lacking. And you do need to know the information, because, you know, Dr. Gonzalez can probably speak to the representations of Black people that he's seen in his research and how that may reflect in today. And Dr. Burton can talk about how, as someone who didn't grow up in America and has been, as he said, he's come to know America by what he sees in our media. I think those are both, as you say, that's why media is, to me, important. And as you say, it's down to the people. And I do hold people accountable, because again, it goes back to the Coen brothers, Tim Burton and others. When Oscar So White came out, these different people would speak up, and they would reflect a kind of ignorance that they were, first off, they assumed outright that they couldn't be racist. And maybe they are or not, but what their thought processes were certainly racist.
Well, I think that where you're going with this is, like, when you look at economics and you look at Black people and you look at media representation, because you're using media. Okay, media, African American people do not own that much in these United States as it pertains to media. There are not many African American anchors. There are not many African American, I don't know if they still call them disc jockeys. I don't know. But there are not, that when you're talking about media, Black people are not represented in media. So my question to you is, how do we represent something where we don't exist, but we're being used? I'm not finished, but we're being used And I have to go back to history, because when you look at media, before media, what was there before media? It's the same reenactment. I mean, Black people have always been placed in a situation where I would say not placed in the limelight that we need to be placed in. I'll put it that way.
As you said, we're being, and that's, I've read many things that talk about Black people get blamed. And again, some of the videos that I showed, that I recommended to you guys, there's an Asian gentleman who's making a legitimate point overall. But, and a video with some Latino individuals talking. They are making legitimate points about their own lacking representation, but they verge on almost blaming Black people for their own hyper visibility. And we're hyper visible because A, we have movements that we've enacted, and usually, unfortunately, is because we've been murdered, like in this context, and that Black people are getting hyper visible in certain forms of media now because we are. So there's no question that we're getting the focus because we're being murdered, and again, it's all using us. But that's why, I mean, I don't know. As you say, I don't know that there is a solution to fix that. That's also, it's on
because
us
I think it's bigger than media representation. Why are Black people just not represented? That's where I think it is. That's where I think the conversation really is in 2020 today at 8. Today's the 25th of August. It's 6:04 p.m. in Texas, and I don't watch TV. I'm a librarian, and that's not to say I read a book every day, but I'm well read. And I will say that, you know, from 9 to 6 o'clock typically, I'm answering questions about history. I'm an African American community archivist. I represent the Black Archive in Austin, Texas. And the reason why I brought history into this conversation is because that is where the conversation really needs to go. Because if you're talking about media representation, I just brought up, what do Black people own? If we go back in our history and we look at our ancestors, a lot of our ancestors were entrepreneurs. So why are we not entrepreneurs today? I think, you know, and I'm not trying to shift this to a, you know, Black America symposium right now. I'm just saying that, you know, we also have a lot to think about. And I also believe, and I will continue to say, that it is very important that you know your history. Dr. King, our ancestors died for that reason, for us to know our history. Because once you know your history, I would hope and I would assume that we would do things differently. I think a lot shifts on us, and I take that responsibility today. A lot is on my back. You know, I stand on shoulders. And I believe that we now, if no one is giving us the torch, we need to take the torch. And then we need to do something with the torch. Because honestly, I'm for myself, we can continue to ask questions, but you started out this conversation with solutions. You wanted solutions.
I agree.
That's what I'm here for. I'm here for solutions.
I don't disagree with the idea of solutions. That is what you said, but
Dr. Burton also has his hand up.
okay.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here, I totally agree with what KYmberly is saying. I think the power to tell our own stories is one of the essential powers to drive that kind of narrative of who we are, right? And a lot of this for me revolves around the career of Spike Lee, right? I think he's one of the most kind of visible filmmakers of color. And when he's making Malcolm X in 1992, right, he has to wrestle that film away from a white director. He has to go to the press and create this big kind of PR campaign. And even then, the studio will only give him a certain amount of money. He has to go kind of hat in hand to Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Oprah Winfrey and Prince to get the money to finish the film. And kind of fast forwarding 25 years, right? He makes, sorry, my phone's ringing. He makes BlacKkKlansman, right? And BlacKkKlansman is a film that, from a historical point of view, actively engages in the kind of dominant histories about the American origin story in the Civil War, right? I don't know if Aston will want to jump in here at some point. But, you know, he actively begins the film with Gone with the Wind, right? One of the most racist films in American history, but the one that's been seen by the majority of Americans more than once. And then later in the film, he engages with Birth of a Nation, right? Which is this film, which is the first big blockbuster. President Wilson calls it history written with lightning. And it essentially rewrites the period of Reconstruction to say that the Ku Klux Klan rescues the South, right? From Reconstruction era. And he wins an Oscar. And this must surely be the time when Spike Lee can make any film that he wants to. So he decides that he wants to make The Five Bloods, right? His Vietnam veteran film, which if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. And yet he goes to every studio and nobody will give him money to make it, because there's this perception that there isn't an audience for Black films abroad, right? Nobody internationally is going to want to do it. And here I think is where we get to a kind of positive moment, which is that Netflix gives him the money. And Netflix says you can do whatever you want with it, because Netflix isn't interested in appealing to advertisers. It's not interested in appealing to any kind of organization outside of itself. It just wants to make sure that it gives people a reason to subscribe every month. So when Orange is the New Black comes up, Netflix, one of my daughter's favorite shows right now is a show called Raising Dion, which is produced by Michael B. Jordan, right, who has become this kind of mini entrepreneur coming out of the great films that he's made. So I think, to bring it back to Spider-Man, which kind of was where we began some of this with William, and into the Spider-Verse, obviously, with Miles Morales is worth mentioning too. Sorry, I love talking about movies, so I get on these kind of rants. But I think, to bring it down to Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think when we talk about the media, we're kind of talking about this abstract entity over which none of us have any control. But media doesn't exist without our eyeballs. Media companies can't make money without us. So making those kind of ethical decisions in our consumer choices is an essential part of this too. So sorry, I feel like I just threw down a whole lot of things there. But I think, you know, that when I look historically in the area of representation, it's depression. It simply is. But when I kind of look to the future, I see some kind of optimistic shoots, right? We've come a long way from, you know, the hyenas in The Lion King, right? Now we have Moana. So even Disney is getting the message.
A lot of what you guys are saying, I'm trying to pull all these streams together because for the last week, I've been binging on research. I think it's multifold in the sense that I like that you pointed out Netflix, Dr. Burton, but it also is, Netflix is dangerous in the sense that it will put up representation of color and then it will just easily take it down. It will put shows out there and then after 2 seasons, suddenly those shows go away. Of different communities of color. One Day at a Time has disappeared. The Get Down disappeared, and so on and so forth. And I mean, the only ones that seem to stay is like Dear White People is this kind of message that's, again, it's more for white people than it is, because it's something that if, you know, I knew it at 8 years old as a Black person, they're still teaching these lessons to white people to this day. And then there's also the responsibility of creatives of color, creators who are in the positions. And largely it's like, I'm thinking of, I take issue with a lot of Tyler Perry's content, but I have a great deal of respect for Tyler Perry because he is giving work to Black people. You know, I might take issue with the specifics of it the same way I take issue with the specifics of Lee Daniels, which I will get to in a second. But they are creating work. Effie Brown talks about it in the article that I read, that it was I just said his name and forgot it. I'm 60 years old at times. Lee Daniels, he was the one who called her and said, literally, sis, you know, how are you doing? She explained her situation and he got her back in the game. And it takes stuff like that it's like, that's Miss Keeton, that goes to what can we do, is, you know, bring each other forward. And one of the things that I bring that up because I've listened to different Latino and Asian actors and movers and shakers in Hollywood talk about how that we have the luxury of African Americans, you know, Miss Keeton and Miss Vargas and you know, Miss Love are my sisters in that way. We are Black people. There's a sense of kinship. There's a shared experience. All, you know, with Black Panther, we all, you know, when I went to the screening I went to, it was Black people, and at different moments there could have been Africans in the room, and there were, you know, West Indians in the room, but we were all joyful at certain moments. And we could all support that, but with Asians and Latinos, because they tend to be lumped together. And in America, when you say Asian, people tend to think of East Asians, but they know that there's this panoply of community. You know, a Mexican's not necessarily going to support a Guatemalan movie or a movie that, you know, he knows it's just going to focus on Mexicans. There may be some animosity between the Korean community and the Japanese community, so they're not going to support that. Who knows the connectivity between South Asian communities and the East Asian community? So that's one of those things too, where it's like, we to some degree are paying it forward, but for other communities it's not. And I'd say that specifically because there are Black people on this panel that can speak to that, but I wanted to make sure to point that out in the sense that that's another issue for them. And also in my research, I was watching a video by, let me make sure I get her name right, Sherliza Moa, or Mo. She's a Mongolian young lady that I learned about Star Wars, is that I was just watching her short 15-minute video, and I learned more about Mongolian history and culture in that 15 minutes than I ever learned in any history class I ever took in college. Is that you can't know to look for a history that you didn't know existed. Is, you know, I'm trying to cover many different points. But I
think you're making your own point really well, William. Remember, and this goes to Dr. Burton's things about Netflix, and remember, gone are the days where there are 3 networks or 3 studios that 6 guys have control of, right? Everybody in America hosts their own TV show. Everybody in America hosts their own radio show daily. Everybody in America has their own newspaper now. William Wallace is a programmer of content. You are the media now, William Wallace. Do you see what you've done? You've created a program and you've put it online. You are now media, right? So it is a democratization. There's a breaking of barriers to entry to all these representations. Now it's the number of eyeballs people are competing for is still a thing, but people know that the number of eyeballs that they're competing for is less and less than ever because there's just so many options. But with the so many options comes the options for everybody to get. So you can even watch now apparently a Mongolian film for William Wallace. So there's less room to complain and more room to create.
I think to draw in what William and Dr. Barrett-Gaines was saying, there's actually a really fascinating point about controlling the means of production. So in my research, I look at how African-American activists use images as part of their activism, starting about 3 decades before the Civil War in the 1830s. And it's pretty clear that once Black folks can create engravings, can create photographs, daguerreotypes at the time, and these other types of visual media, they don't play into the same stereotypes that a lot of white artists do at that time. Instead, they show Black people, formerly enslaved, sometimes free, born free, as people, as humans, who are worthy of education, worthy of rights. And it is very clear that they are creating this content, if we want to use sort of 21st century or 20th century language, they're creating this content that goes against, it really rubs up against these stereotypes, racial caricatures that are, as you mentioned, William, earlier, based in how people look, how they act, how they speak. I think this is also what Dr. Barrett-Gaines was saying earlier. And Black folks, when they control these means of production, they fundamentally change the whole body of work that people, different populations, different subgroups can access. They market their materials as broadly as possible to men, to women, to children across the nation. People who are Black, people who are white, right? They are really trying to make sure that the people who see their images are given something new and different and powerful, and something that will change the way that they fundamentally think about people of African descent, that they should not be enslaved, that they should have the right to vote, that they should have access to public education in the ways that many other people or children and adults of different races had. I mean, it's still pretty limited then compared to today's standards in the US, but my point is that there is an incredible democratization of, and this was to get to Dr. Barrett-Gaines's point, a democratization of images and how people can control how they view themselves by producing images of themselves, their family members, and people of their own race to much broader audiences. Before, you had to be very, very, in a way, lucky or privileged or connected to learn the art of engraving. It took years. You had to be an apprentice for several years to a master crafts person, usually a man, almost always a man. And that was it. There was just a handful of engravers in even large cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, etc. But once that goes away, once there are people who can create photographs, right? Who learn the art of photography by, you know, a traveling salesperson coming through, right? They buy the chemicals, they buy the equipment, and they can create their own images. That changes further in the 1880s and 90s when Kodak comes out with the Brownie camera. And it's still expensive, but millions of these Brownie cameras are sold. So people can go into their backyards, go into their homes, take these cameras to their places of work and photograph the people who are most important to them, their pets, right? Like their friends, like all of these individuals who previously were not depicted in the images that were created for centuries beforehand in nearly as large of numbers. So it's about seizing these means of production, about controlling that media, and about doing right by it, and sort of the language that we're using today.
And I would say going after is it Dr. Gonzalez? Dr. Gonzalez, I think everything that you're saying has to do with history. They knew their history. If you know your history, how are you going to represent your history? We're talking about representation. If you know your history, how would you, each person on this panel, represent your history today? Would it be a different history? And who I see today, and I'm looking at Dr. Burton. I'm just gonna say all doctors. So if you're not, oh well, just accept the title. Dr. Burton, Dr. Grace, Dr. Gonzalez, Dr. Kathryn, Dr. Love. How would you portray your history today? If Dr. Gonzalez gave you a camera, would it be the same history that we've been seeing that we saw yesterday?
Well, that's an interesting point, because one of the things I was thinking about with is in Dr. Kendi's book, he talks about how even Black people can play into respectability politics. And Tyler Perry, I don't know if Tyler Perry, he does to some degree, plays into respectability politics. And Lee Daniels himself says, white people can call us the N-word and still love us. Now, maybe he feels that way, and God bless, but you know, but that's why it's important to pay attention to who's putting out the media, because a Black man who believes that is the voice of Black people. He's putting it out there. And I should be able to connect with Lee Daniels more than most, because Lee Daniels and I are both Black gay men. But when I hear that, I'm okay, well, you know, I hear you, but I don't hear you.
But he only represents himself, William. You represent yourself.
He gets to speak.
But can I pick up on Ms. Keeton's point about history? and I love what you're saying, because think about this too. We always talk about, we're blaming the, the victor, whatever you want to call it. But if white people knew their history, remember when Ben Affleck went on that show where he found out his ancestors were slave owners and he wanted it edited out. He wanted to edit that out of his life. Now, if white people really had a truth and reconciliation moment with their own lives and their own families and their own backgrounds, the stories probably would look different too. If white people didn't turn out to be the heroes, if their white fathers weren't as great as they think they were, their grandfathers were, low down, people, then maybe the stories would be a lot more honest. We're talking, I think Ms. Keeton is talking about truth, because truth must come before reconciliation. Truth must come first. And truth is not just, let's talk about African-American history as truth. Let's talk about the truth of white history.
Dr. Okubo?
So I was jotting down some notes because there's so much that's been said here. But I wanted to go back to the point that keeps on coming back, which is about responsibility. Right? So each of us have responsibility, and depending on the roles and the place and the privilege and the power or lack of power we may have, that we have different responsibilities, right? So if we are actually producing or writing or casting someone, we may actually have the power and the privilege to be able to, actually give someone a voice as opposed to taking that person's voice away. If we were educators or librarians, or, if we have the power and the privilege to actually choose a textbook. I don't know, I still remember to this day where I had a textbook that was written by a person of color for the first time, and how different that felt. And in the same vein, how my white classmates kind of had this huge reaction that they just couldn't understand as to why they were having such big negative reaction to the authors, and not being able to kind of take the message in, but to sort of have this reaction of like, I keep on questioning this person's voice and authority. And so I think each of us, have a certain responsibility that we can sort of think about, and what is our power, whether it be a consumer or, creator. Right. I think there is something that we can do that we tend to forget. Like, what is it that we can do in this moment in time with the power and privilege that we may have? Also, this notion of history repeating itself. I just wanted to kind of talk about, the history repeats itself partly because when people are oppressed and then they're given the power, they don't know how to act without being the oppressor, right? They only have seen or being experienced what it's like to be oppressed, and they have also studied what the oppressors do, right? As Paulo Freire talks about with the pedagogy of the oppressed. So I think in order to come out of that, we really need to think about the systemic aspect of racism that is at play, right? So a lot of it has to do with people of color being pitted against each other. And whether it's model minority myth or other stereotypes that people are actually essentially, being portrayed in such a way so that we can kind of pull each other down to uphold white supremacy is essentially what's going on. And so we need to figure out a way to dismantle that, right? Which is, if we have an answer to that, then we wouldn't be having this conversation, I don't think. But that's sort of at play. But I think it is important, though, to think about what each of us can do in our day-to-day lives, though, to kind of either chip away at it or to sort of change the course in terms of where we're headed. I'll stop there.
No, I think you just crystallized something that I was thinking about, that I think Ms. Keeton is absolutely correct. Because then at several points, especially while I was reading Dr. Keeton's book, I said to my coworkers earlier today that, you know, I think you need something like a Dr. Keeton's book to teach people how to be responsible, because they do need to know their history. They do need to know their individual power, like it is with their vote. Is that you vote on representation by not watching something or engaging with something, but you have to know that this thing is rooted in something problematic. One of the articles that I read was talking about, not already known about this, is the content creator in particular, Shane Dawson. Now, he's one of the more egregious examples that in the course of his career, he had done blackface and used the N-word, and in addition to his pedophilic and content arena where he had some implied a sexual relationship with his cat. But people he had a Black audience that was okay with that. It had been normalized to that, you know, it was okay because it was a joke. Is people need to know why blackface is dehumanizing. And it's like Shane Dawson wasn't doing some, you know, what Sarah Silverman tried to attempt to say that she was doing. He was doing blackface that was reminiscent of, you know, of the kind of blackface that, you know, Dr. Gonzalez would have seen probably in his, you know, research. It's like, and he didn't even have the uplifting intention that Al Jolson claimed that he had. Is we need to teach people so that when they encounter something like Shane Dawson, they immediately let that go. And then if he has a remaining audience that is largely white, well, then we need to interrogate that, because then Shane Dawson is teaching a whole generation. My coworker is 20, they just turned 24. They would have came of age watching that kind of content. There's a whole generation of young adults who was taught that dehumanizing Black and Latinx people was okay, you know? So that we have to teach them that this kind of thing is problematic and why. You know, somebody has to teach them that, it's even down to why, you know, what was the comedian? I can't think of her name, but she wanted people to boycott Netflix because they were paying her this deeply reduced amount that they were paying Black male comedians. She had won an Oscar, and they weren't giving her nearly as much. They didn't pay her as much as they paid a white female comedian. But yeah, nobody Monique. Was. Yeah. Monique. I'm sorry?
Like somebody said, Monique.
Yes, Monique. You know, Monique had won an Oscar, and maybe whatever her motivations were, she made a valid argument. Is that's how we get change is by people showing that they won't support this kind of thing, that they don't watch any more comedy specials until Monique gets paid what she's deserved, or any other Black performer. We need to, people need to be engaged. And that's one of the things that this pandemic, the unfortunate reality of the pandemic is, because so many Americans are home, we're also seeing traction on Black Lives Matter because so many people were at home to watch the brutal murder of, George Floyd. And, so people need to be engaged. They need to tell the story that you need to pay attention to this. We need to pay attention that Netflix, as good as it is and as many opportunities as it offers, Netflix wanted to whitewash one of the movies that it made, To All the Boys I Loved Before. It was written by, I believe, an Asian writer, and the main character is Asian, and all the production studios that this person was trying to workshop with wanted to whitewash it. And I mean, we need to know these things. We need to care about these things, and that's where it's like knowing your history, but knowing, where does that begin? It's like I learned to value myself and understand my own power when I got to college, when I had the fortune to go to an HBCU. I had the fortune to, sit in Dr. Raymond and Dr. Barrett-Gaines classes and learn. And both of these were white people. And I learned lessons about my Blackness, being surrounded by Black people, African Black people, and West Indian Black people, and other African Americans. But how are we going to get younger people? You know, my nephews are, one is 16, the other is 14. How do we get, that's why I say I love solutions, but I want the solutions to meet people where they're at. You know, we have to meet the teenage boy, the teenage girl, the non-binary teenager in the place that they're at. You know, that's why I bring up video games and YouTube, is because how do we teach them that to value themselves, to realize that this content is not acceptable, that they have other options? Dr. Burton?
Yeah, William, I think you kind of answered your own question in a lot of ways. You know, you said Netflix is trying to whitewash this particular show. We need to know about that. And I think the important thing is that we do know about that. You know, and we know about that because people are able to take more active roles in informing other people about their circumstances. You know, if you go back 20 years, if somebody loses a role in Hollywood, nobody hears about it. If people are complaining that Scarlett Johansson is playing an originally Japanese character in Ghost in the Shell, no one hears about it. Whereas now, because we have this almost kind of like, what would be a word for it? You know, almost like a kind of activism on social media where we are spreading these ideas and people protesting and coming up with these kind of campaigns. I mean, I think somebody mentioned Oscar So White at another point in this conversation. And that was a campaign that had a very concrete impact, right? The Academy totally overthrew its membership, welcomed in hundreds and hundreds of new people from groups not previously represented in the Academy. And a few years later, Moonlight wins Best Picture, right? And, you know, although of course Green Book wins, but we won't say much about Green Book. But so we have this situation where we have the capabilities to make these things alert now. So you can tell your nephews, read this. This is the important thing for you to read about this show that you like, or check out this show on whatever streaming service it happens to be, and let that service know when you're not happy. I mean, if the last few years, I think in the entertainment industry have shown anything, is that they're so hyper scared about any type of bad publicity that they are willing to overthrow many of their kind of dominant practices of recent years. That's not to say that the old boys club isn't still there, but the churn is beginning to happen at many of the kind of upper levels. That's really been the dominant story.
Yeah, and as you know, there's never one solution, never one reason for anything, right? There's always the Michael Jordan coincidences, right, that cause something to happen. And also there's many, many different kinds of solutions. And one thing that we can't, and we've brought it up, several of us have brought it up, the fundamental injustice that we call education in this country is definitely at fault. The fundamental economic disparities, these are all part of our problem, right? That people are educated differently, people are valued differently, people are literally financially valued and actuarially valued differently. So all of these are part of what goes into making a child, even a child, prefer a black child might even, you know, prefer white characters and white stuff. I mean, it's part of, we've known this for decades, it's part of what we grew up in. And so we just keep on going, right? Somebody said something about power being given. Power's never given, right? Power's only ever grabbed and snatched, and then it's never kept until you keep on fighting. So there's no solution. There's just constant maintenance and education and not going to sleep. Oh, Tim Burton's here. Oh, Jim.
Hold on, Mr. Davis, and then Dr. Sutherland.
Dr. Okubo also had something to say, I think.
I'm sorry, what?
Dr. Okubo also had her hand up.
Okay, but Mr. Davis had his hand up first, and then Dr. Sutherland, then Dr.
Yeah, just out into the list.
Oh yeah, so
Davis?
When you were talking about the social media, about YouTube, I was thinking that essentially our youth, my generation, we are all influenced by social media. We're influenced by, like you said, the education. It starts with that. It starts with, for example, things like what's popular right now is a social media called TikTok. I don't know if you've heard of it, but TikTok is like, it's like short clips of people doing skits, comedy, just anything, and all of those little things can affect a person, especially youth, because the youth is really who's using it. Things like YouTube is, it might be longer, like longer clips and stuff, but it can reach a larger audience, people who can be anywhere in the world. And I think the social medias, those are really what influence everyone. I think that's one reason why we are looked at a specific way. It's those people who are putting those up there. The things that get really popular are usually the things that are negative, negative connotation, negative everything. I think that those are, that's why people are looked at certain ways. They're like, oh yeah, this is a stereotype that I know only because of this video, only because of this picture, only because of this person. And so I think that was just something that I had on my brain.
I mean, that's a great point, in the sense that I think a lot of people do learn by watching, like you said, they may be introduced to something for the first time through a YouTuber or a TikTok, and oftentimes they only learn that it's wrong after that TikTok person or YouTube person has to apologize for disrespecting a different community. Dr. Southerland? I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I'm finished.
Dr. Southerland? If you come back, Dr. Southerland, you'll just have to let me know. Dr. Okubo, I think you had something to say.
Yeah. So William, you were mentioning earlier about, like, you know, how and when should I talk to my nephew and niece about, you know, different sort of what is called difficult dialogues, right? Like where it be racism or misrepresentation or lack of representation, all those things are considered as difficult dialogues. And I think, you know, in my research with on race dialogue, where I ask people, you know, how do they have conversations about race and racism and racial identity and race relations, when is a best time? Like it's never a best time, right? Like I think what we learned in this pandemic also, as well as, you know, the murders of Black folks in the last, you know, few months, that has been really kind of orchestrated in the media, is that it's never a good time. Like people are going to learn it the hard way, and unfortunately we're hit by it with all social media, right? Like the convenience comes with that unfortunate unfiltered way in which it hits us. But I think what becomes then important is how we have those conversations, whether they're 5 years old or 10 years old or 75 years old. We need to start having more of those conversations. But the key, I think, is how we are going to have it and how can we meet them where they're at in ways that they can actually hear what you have to say. And, you know, even if you don't agree with one another, how can we keep the conversation going? And so I'm definitely learning that, and, you know, from my research, those are sort of the things that people struggle with. Like the one is usually they don't have control over that. It just happens, or they get thrust into it and they're all of a sudden having this conversation. And the key is, well, how are you going to have it and where does it take you?
I think that's a fascinating point, because I was thinking, you know, in this particular moment, you know, the obvious issue right now is, you know, because of Black Lives Matter protests, as a Black person, I am particularly connected to that. But at the beginning of the pandemic, Asian Americans were targeted for the Chinese flu. Whatever your East Asian ethnicity was, or Southeast Asian ethnicity, you could have gotten the same backlash that brown Asians got after 9/11. And of course, you know, there are still to this day Latinos in cages we'll call it now, is that it goes back to something you said earlier about that. It's that there needs to be a solidarity of realizing that in those instances, those things happen to communities of color, and if there's that it's like we let it happen to the union workers and I did nothing. It happened to that next group and I did nothing. Is that connectivity to have that conversation of, oh, it happened, when Black people are killed, there needs to be a narrative in Asian and Latinx houses for why this, it could be me next, or how this impacts me. When this happens to Muslims or Southeast or East Asians, and this happens, we need to say something because it's wrong, because it's going to impact all of us. And it's why it's incumbent upon all of us to learn the histories of each other. It's why I took a Latin American history course in college, why I took a East Asian studies course in college, is because we need to know about each other. That's why it's important to have representation of other communities of color, because it adds to the richness of our lives. But, I don't know how to, I remember one of the packets my nephew got for his schooling from home was, it just happened to be about samurais. And it was like, my nephew had absolutely no interest in it. Now, maybe if it had been the recent video game, Ghost of Tsushima, he would have been engaged. But that's why I say, how the lessons that you're talking about, the conversations, if it's through those narratives, is that how we humanize people through video games? Thanks to my nephews,
William, you keep on answering your own question. You keep on doing this. You keep on answering your own questions. You do precisely what you did. You read your nephew's homework and you talk about it with him. That's exactly how you do it. You are engaged with him. He will talk about you for the rest of his life, because he will say, my uncle pointed this out, my uncle said this, my uncle said that. That's your job, and you're apparently doing it very well.
So one of the things that I wanted to say is, what we're talking about is extremely complex and messy, because our history is extremely complex, horrific, and messy. So that's point number one. Point number two, therefore, our solutions must be complex and a little bit messy at the same time, because we're not going to always get it right. So point number three is, we're talking about balance. We're talking about balance. So as much as I loved watching the Good Times, I needed to see the Cosby Show. As much as I loved the Jeffersons, my child needed to see a different world. So what we need to be demanding of all sources of media is a balance, because we cannot excuse the beginning of BET, no more than we can excuse what's happening in current media today. I went to see the movie Queen and Slim. I loved it up until the end, and that was a Black dominated film. But what frustrated and angered me was the image that we always die in. We gotta die in the end. Why can't we walk off into the sunset sometimes and win at the end of the day? And I'm sure that we do, but we don't see those images enough. The next thing that we need to do is, we can't all be in the same spaces. Some of us need to be on school boards, making sure arts remain as part of the curriculum. Some of us need to be in colleges and universities, making sure that young people are learning about marketing and media and acting and producing and owning and so forth. And then lastly, I have to respectfully disagree with Dr. Barrett-Gaines. I do believe that power can be given, just like wealth can be transferred. Every time I teach my child something or give them a good book about our history, I'm giving them power. But that power has to be transformed into wisdom and then influence and then leverage to do something good for all of our people.
Mr. Davis?
I didn't have anything to say.
Okay.
I was just, yeah.
Hand was still up, that's why.
Oh, no.
Go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Oh, no. I think it just was up. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think, I mean, at different points, there's so many thoughts that have flashed through my head. Is that I absolutely agree that it will have to be messy. The solutions will have to be as messy as the history. But it's also, then it comes back to a sense of accountability. I think, I forget which one of you said it, but I immediately thought of what one of you were saying was, I thought of The Color Purple at some point, because it talked about people they get this thing and then they start to, the Black men imposed their power on Black women in The Color Purple. They started to treat Black women the way that, they had been, the Black men and Black women had been treated during slavery. They made Black women their slaves. To this day, Black women are marginalized by Black men. In the Black Lives Matter movement, despite the hashtag being started by 3 Black women, 2 of which were lesbians and could personally say, I have no use for Black men or any man, they still created a movement that they knew they would be marginalized in. And I'm using Black women because they're the ones that I know the most about. They're the ones that I've been taught to have the most respect for. But that's where it adds that nuance, as you say, it's messy. Is that we have to look within ourselves to, and I don't know how this reflects in Asian or Latino communities, but how Black men play into the marginalizing of Black women is that, something has happened with Mr. Floyd. And I forget, unfortunately, because there are so many names, but the Black man who was killed in the Wendy's parking lot situation, there was action on his death, but still to this day, we're asking for action on Breonna Taylor. Still to this day, Black women are disrespected by Black men. I've read countless, tweets and articles about, whether ASAP Rocky or Kodak Black or XYZ name that demonizes Black women, Black dark-skinned women are this, that, or a third thing. And it's all coming from Black men. And it leaves Black women open to being attacked by somebody else. I mean, so we have to, as I'm using this as an example to say that the solution needs to be messy, is that we need to recognize overall, we have to lay ourselves bare. And one of the things Miss Kum talks about in her article about East Asian, coming of age stories, is that she is uncomfortable sometimes talking about her community and being honest about her community in the way that I just was about the Black community, because then it can be used by uninformed, ignorant communities to attack us. But it still needs to be said. A Black man still needs to hold other Black men accountable and say, we need to do better by Black women, because when we die, I can't think of his name again, because there are just so many. He died in his grandmother's backyard. I can remember the circumstances, not all the names. He died in his grandmother's backyard. And that same Black man, when people went back to look at his social media, he had been demonizing Black women for years.
But wait, William. First of all, nobody deserves to die because they're a sexist. And you can't just be a perfect person who is, we can't just feel sorry for victims of gun violence when they're perfect. Remember, we started out this conversation by saying we must recognize each other's humanity. And Black men also are human. And Black men also get to be jerks. They also get to be JJ. They also get to be whatever the heck they want to be. And
that's not the argument I'm making. I'm making the argument that we don't have to be perfect for Black women to support us. That's the whole point, is that Black women still saw that. They were upset by it, and then they continued to support them.
Well, you just slammed those two lesbian founders of Black Lives Matter by saying they have no use. They have no use for Black men. But wait a minute, do lesbians have plenty of use for men?
No, that's what I'm making the point. The reverse point actually is that these women could say, I have no use for these men, and I could do nothing, but they still love Black people, the Black community enough that they said, I know I'm going to be subjugated in my own movement that I may start, but I'm still going to do it. The same way that Black women participated in the suffragist movement, and they were actively being told to shut up about their Blackness. The same way that, you know, she didn't know it at the time, but Marsha P. Johnson, you know, is ignored as being the central figure in it, but she still did it. You know, and there's so many other instances of Black women doing it while not being recognized or knowing that Black women in the civil rights movement. You know, I didn't know who, I said this before in another Each One Teach One, I didn't know who Ella Baker was or Elaine Brown until I took your class.
Yeah, and that's why I taught that class, because when we think of Black power, we don't usually think of women. And if you look at Black women, and if you look at power, it's a female history. We know this. Women are powerful, and yeah, I think that if we're smart, we follow Black women's lead in America. But that, you're right. The irony is when you talk about, you know, economic levels, power levels, socio-cultural images, Black women are always at the bottom, ironically, and usually the most powerful in our culture. So yeah, we're a mess. You pointed it out. So it's just a mess.
I mean, we have to be balanced, and we should not always internalize the images that we are given. Black folks are not the only people that's a mess. Human beings are a mess.
Well, no, I didn't. I point out.
Oh, definitely. No, we are. Oh, we are with no. When I said we, there's no. It's not about being Black. It's Oh no. I wasn't.
But I was thinking more about the Black men who abuse women. Okay, but there are white people, men who abuse women as well, and there are Black men who love their women.
Black people. I talk about Black people because that's what I know. I can research other communities, but I live Blackness every day. I know Black examples. And I don't by any means think that Black men, I can't think that because I know that I don't. I know that I know the humanity of Black people. I know we're not just the one thing. I use that as the example. And like I said with Ms. Newman, she said about her own community. The danger of pointing it out is that it may reinforce people's ideals. But past a certain point, I have to move away from that. You know, their ignorance is theirs. If you're in this conversation, participating in it, and you don't have desire to look into what I'm saying and look beyond it, because God knows I am not an authority on anything. You know, I got my degree 10 years ago, and what I may have learned 10 years ago may be useless now. But that's why it's like, we have to sometimes shame ourselves and be willing to admit that we're wrong. The Black community has to be willing to admit that R. Kelly and Bill Cosby, for whatever they did for the Black community, did all this harm to the Black community. And it was the harm that they did, in R. Kelly's case in particular, was largely to Black women. And we have to be willing to let him go. And we have to be willing to call ourselves out. And again, I am using the Black community because that is my community and the one that I know. But it is also in the aid of solution-based, is that for other communities of color, everybody has to look within themselves and the inequities within their community. We have to look to the Black people who engage in respectability politics, which also Dr. Cosby did, is that I bring them up because that is the important work of creating solutions, is to be honest with ourselves about the problems. We cannot fix it, as so many people have brought up during the Black Lives Matter movement, is if we say that Black Lives Matter, we have to agree that all Black lives matter, that Black women matter too, that in this period where we have heard about Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor, at least to my knowledge, 4 Black trans women have died, I think, in the same period, and probably more. But I don't remember their names, and some people don't know their names. Is that we have got to be willing to do that kind of work for any solution that has to be happen. And it's as Dr. Okubo said, it's going to be messy because white people wrote our narrative, and we do have more of a voice now, but we have to choose the kind of narrative, and that includes, again, the Black community, but I'm also talking about other communities of color. Because in all the research that I was doing and in some of the videos that I watched, I heard those young Asian girls and those young Latina girls talk about how they were represented, and based on what they were saying, it was the same thing as happening to them that has happens to Black women. You know, colorism is an issue for different reasons in almost every community of color, you know? And so I think that's something that, you know, unfortunately, we've only got about 3 minutes left, and I would love to continue this conversation in another form, is that's the work that's going to have to be done. Is that when we create this media for ourselves, whenever we find the means to, we have to be honest about the story that we're telling. And like you said about Queen and Slim, and I've heard other people complain in similar directions, is that was a Black creation, but at the end, we still died in the end. You know, it's like we have to ask ourselves, well, why did we do that? We had a chance to tell the story differently, and we didn't. You know, I think that's the way forward, is to recognize what's been done to us and what we're going to do now with the power and influence that we have. What are we doing with the means that we have? What stories is Tyler Perry telling with all that he has? Again, I gave him credit for what he is doing for the Black community. And I don't often have nice things to say about Tyler Perry, but I will always give him credit.
You haven't said a nice thing about Tyler Perry in 10 years. But I just want to point out one thing about Tyler Perry. A lot of people go to his movies. A lot.
But in those movies.
And they don't get forced there. They choose to buy those tickets.
Absolutely. But in those movies, he perpetuates stereotypes about, he engages in a lot of his shows, buffoonery, his character. I can't think of I can only think of the connections. I can't think of his name, but the father of her child, Medea's child, he's a buffoon in the same vein as JJ was in Good Times.
But to go back to the professor's point about balance, there is a role for the buffoon in American culture. All American culture has had a buffoon. Every show, you know, all cultures tell stories with a buffoon in it.
Oh no, I agree absolutely, and I get on tangents, but and we've got to close out. But I'll say this: it's absolutely one of the things that I noticed in this conversation about J.K. Rowling and her what they call turfing, or trying to exclude trans women, was that she was engaging in this thing. She was playing into the notion that only so many female stories can be told. And she was angry at trans women because women only get, we're going to say for the sake of conversation, they only get 200 stories. And then every white men get 2,000. And she was like, no, we cannot let these trans women take up our female stories. She was making her sisters, you know, the bad guy, when these women, just like she, wanted their stories told. And you know, that's where it's like, you know, I don't have any problem with them in face. It's that we all know, whether it's real or fair or not, is that that mainstream media is only going to tell so many stories. Mainstream media is only going to have token characters. In a Netflix show, a cartoon that I watched to go to sleep to, they have a show where the leads are a Latina boy and an Asian girl. And there's no Black character, because the notion that Black people, if there's a Black character, that Black character is going to take over. Or it creates that division that Dr. Okubo referenced, and that, you know, that it's like, we can't all be together in this thing, that we can't all work together. It's like, well, if Asians and Latinos get something, Black people can't get it. Black people have to be left out of it.
Yeah, there's this assumption that this is a zero-sum game. Instead of, you know, increasing the pie, so to speak, people think that we're only competing for these limited resources. But I think your points earlier about the expansion of the networks like Hulu and Netflix. I mean, these are amazing shows that are being shown on these fairly new platforms. I mean, Jane the Virgin, there's Hentified, there are all kinds of shows that are giving voice to different communities that previously didn't make it to ABC, NBC, CBS in quite the same way, if at all. So I think that expansion of opportunity is there. We'll see how it develops in the next couple of years, especially in this hopefully soon to be post-COVID pandemic time. But I think you make a really great point there, William.
And because we're already 2 minutes over. To close out though, I think again it goes back to things that are important to me, which is the solidarity amongst people. Is to, you know, I feel a first loyalty to Black people and then other people of color because of our shared connection that we should rise together. Is that we have to, it was a few years ago with the Oscars So White, they had a Black host. And what did the Black host go and do? He demonized Asian people in one of the skits. Is that with Jane the Virgin, the lead in that, Gina Rodriguez, I think is her name, she has engaged in anti-Blackness. She engages in that zero-sum game of, well, you know, when a Black woman is being praised, I think she's in an interview with a young Black woman. And while that young Black woman is being praised, she inserts this notion of, she talks about Latinos, and I'm all for it. But I've also noticed that in a lot of Black women, when they accept awards and stuff like that, they acknowledge people of color. It's not as if they aren't, that Black women aren't out there talking about Black women and saying other women of color's names. They will say Constance Wu's name.
But William, but remember, you are now talking about people who do theater and arts for a living, people who love to perform before audiences. We know those people already have personality disorders and problems, right? So you're now saying that they got to be perfect. They already have this incredible burning desire to be loved by strangers. So you got to remember that, right? Remember, they're very flawed humans to start with.
This is, again, with if we could spend 2 hours talking about, and that's one thing that, again, Dr. Kendi says, that sometimes you have to separate it away from people and talk about systems. And I use her name specifically, not because she's irredeemable, but because, you know, that may speak to the fact that maybe all celebrities, you know, I hate to sound like the Fox News host that told the Black basketball players to shut up and dribble, is to just shut up and act.
No. I don't think that's what I'm saying. But can I tie two things together? Because I think they're two really important things we can tie together. If power is not automatically given except by, you know, us to our children, and we have to take it, then there's also times right now when COVID is shrinking resources and shrinking stuff, that we have to be ever mindful that we can predict a whitening and heterosexualizing of media. So we got to watch, got to be careful, got to keep demanding and keep the pressure on. This is the time to be mindful and put pressure, our own personal and public and unionized pressure, to keep these spaces open and keep this conversation going, which William Wallace, you're doing an excellent job doing.
I hate to end it there. And like I said, I would love to continue this conversation in another form because this only scratches the surface of it. I am incredibly grateful for everybody who was able to participate in this conversation, and thank you. And like I said, hopefully we can, I'm gonna attempt to do something like this in podcast form so that more people can focus specifically on the particular things. But again, I would like to come back with a wider conversation because we all have something to contribute to this from each in your individual areas. So with that, I'm gonna call this to a close and thank you again, and thank you everybody for attending this and who watches this later.
Thank you very much, William.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job,
Bye,
William Wallace. Thank you so much, everybody. That was great.
Have a great night.